Hi, and welcome to our series on mental wellness, Calm and Focused. I'm Dr. Wang, CMO of High Focus Centers. Our second episode is on trauma and COVID-19. With us today is Lindsay Wheeler, Executive Director of our Lawrenceville site. She's a licensed clinical social worker and licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor who has worked in outpatient, intensive outpatient, and partial hospitalization programs over the past decade. She has particular expertise in the treatment of trauma and co-occurring disorders, and she's implemented a very successful trauma program at our Lawrenceville location in 2018. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be doing this podcast with you as, you know, the area of trauma is a very important topic for me and really important that we're talking about it more in our communities with what we're seeing right now with the current pandemic. So when we talk about trauma, I think it's just really important to understand what trauma actually is, but also how trauma impacts our brains, our bodies, and then what we really need to recover. So simply put, trauma is really defined as exposure to actual or threatened injury, violence, or death. And trauma can be both individualized or it can actually be collective. So when we talk about the pandemic, we would look at that as a collective trauma, in that it impacts the individual, but is also impacting a large group of individuals. So other types of collective trauma that people might think about is something like a war or a natural disaster. But for the purpose of this conversation, we're really talking about the current pandemic.
So hang on a sec, like everyone that is exposed to dangerous situations like an immediate threat or physical threat develops trauma?
So that's a really good question. And no, not exactly in that way that trauma is a subjective experience. So what that really means is that all individuals may be impacted in a different way by that same collective experience. So I think we can all agree right now, if you were to look around in your communities with how people are responding to COVID, everyone's responding to it in a very different way. So when we talk about the collective trauma, we're also talking about the individual experience within the collective whole.
I see. Are there further ways to distinguish between different classifications or different types of trauma?
Yeah, so for the purpose of this discussion, I want to talk about three different types of trauma. So there's the one-time life-altering event, there's the ongoing and repetitive trauma, and then there's the abrupt changes to daily living. So the one-time life-altering event is exactly what it sounds like. That's something like a major accident or an injury, or even something more severe like a violent attack or an assault. And ongoing and repetitive trauma is something that happens over and over. So we see this a lot with childhood neglect or abuse. Sadly, we see it with domestic violence. We're also seeing it a lot in our school systems. I think we're seeing a lot of bullying, both online and in person. And we might even see this in violent neighborhoods or if you're managing a major significant medical illness. And then there's the abrupt changes to daily living. I like to focus on this because this is often very overlooked. And the reason why it's overlooked is because a lot of us experience these abrupt changes. So that might be a sudden death of a loved one, really humiliating, derogatory experiences, a breakup or divorce, which I think most people have experienced in their lifetime, or a job loss. So when I say they're overlooked, it's that usually when these abrupt changes happen, in the beginning, people are really compassionate, right? They reach out to you. But then over time, it's kind of like, get over it, move on, enough time has passed. So although these are common stressors for most of us, it's often the circumstances that are surrounding them combined with the stressor that might trigger a traumatic response. So for example, I think we can use a current job loss. So for some people right now, if they've lost their job, it might be really exciting. They might feel like they can try new experiences, focus on themselves, try a new hobby. But for someone else, that might mean, you know, they don't have food for their family. They're going to lose their home. They don't have money for medical needs. So again, looking at that collective versus individualized experience, it's really important to look at the whole person rather than just the isolated situation when we're supporting people who may have experienced these events.
So say I've experienced some intense traumatic events. How can other people tell that I've developed some sort of traumatic response? What are the signs of that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think a lot of trauma symptoms people hide really well. And, it's one of those things where it's not like a broken bone, right? You get a cast, people sign it and get well soon. And then you take the cast off and you're all better, you're all fixed. So with trauma symptoms, they're often really hidden and they're masked. So we need to acknowledge both the physical and the emotional symptoms with trauma because our mind and our bodies, they're connected, right? They're working together all the time. So the emotional and psychological symptoms might include feelings like guilt and shame. And shame is one of those emotions that is really prevalent with trauma, but we don't talk about it enough. Feelings of anxiety, fear, shock or denial. Some people might isolate, feel really sad or depressed. And then there's also that feeling of almost being numb or disconnected, like not feeling anything at all. For the physical symptoms, I really like to point out that trauma is more than flashbacks. I think people see trauma in the movies and they think, oh, it's just flashbacks and panic attacks, but it's more than that. Those physical symptoms might be insomnia, oversleeping, having nightmares, a lot of like heart rate issues, increased heart rate, GI issues. And then some people might even experience like they're in a dreamlike state, right? Like the environment doesn't feel real, they don't feel real, or they're kind of in a fog.
Now, are there less common signs of trauma that people may not assume are part of a traumatic response?
Yeah. And I think when we say like less common, I think what we kind of mean is that they're not so much in your face, right? So they might be looked at as like, oh, they're just having a mood swing or, oh, they're just grumpy today. But less common signs might be feeling really angry or having a lot of irritability. You might feel really confused, even having difficulty concentrating, having a lot of negative thoughts about yourself or the future, maybe even feeling like disconnected to your support system. And then with some people, we might even see like an increase in impulsive behaviors. You might see this a lot in teenagers as well. And that might also include, substance abuse or just a lot of impulsive, dangerous behaviors.
Now, bringing that into the present, we're about 6 months or so into the COVID-19 pandemic. How would you conceptualize this as trauma for many individuals?
Yeah, it's definitely been a day-by-day process, right? I think every day we're just wondering, is tomorrow going to be better? What's the news going to bring? And I think a lot of us can relate that right now the current pandemic can feel like there's no end in sight. So what that can really do to people is put you in a state of crisis just for several months. Like there's no relief from the crisis. So I think for many people, they might be even recovering from being infected themselves. Maybe they've lost a family member to COVID. And then on top of all of that, they're worried about their own health, their families, their finances, food, healthcare, all of those basic things that we need to survive. It's always at the forefront of our minds right now. So being in that constant state of crisis and always being in survival mode, that really causes our central nervous system to be in overdrive. And when that happens, when that central nervous system's in overdrive, you can start to see some significant increase in mental health symptoms, and that can make just daily living very unmanageable.
So, central nervous system. So you're talking about like the brain stem, the spinal cord. So what does it mean when you say central nervous system on overdrive?
Yeah, so when I talk about trauma, I always like to say how really amazing our brain is. I think that trauma symptoms are so uncomfortable. They're really hard to live with, and you can really start to just feel crazy, and really out of control. But the brain is so amazing in that it's doing its job. It's trying to protect you, trying to process all this information and figure out, what is this experience that's happening to me right now? And, like I said before, a lot of individuals think trauma is just emotions. It's just flashbacks, but it's so much more complicated than that. And people don't realize how much of your brain is actually involved with that experience. So when we talk about the central nervous system really being on overdrive, what we're really talking about is that our internal fire alarm that we all have is constantly being activated to respond to danger, even when there might not be any danger present.
Mm-hmm. So I can see that as perhaps an evolutionary advantage, where dangerous situations, life-threatening situations will evoke a traumatic response to improve our survival. But maybe in more modern, more civilized times, that fire alarm may be more maladaptive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about in your own house, right? If your fire alarm was going off all the time, that might signal something's really wrong in your house, right? So we kind of want to look at our bodies the same way. Mm-hmm. So with that prolonged exposure to any type of life-threatening stressor or trauma, that fire alarm kind of starts to misfire. And then we have this ongoing activation of our nervous system, and we're always on sensory overload. So really, what does that mean? Like I said before, is that your body and your mind can feel unsafe when you're not in danger if that fire alarm's always misfiring. So a really simple example that I could just use right now is that, let's say you're sitting at home and you think, I need to get out of the house, right? I think we're all feeling that right now. I need to just go for a walk. I need to get out. And you haven't even left your couch yet, but you just start to think about going outside, and suddenly your heart rate's increasing, you're sweating, you're starting to feel panicked, and you start to have a panic attack. You haven't even moved yet. You haven't even done anything, but just that thought or that idea of even going for a walk can result in such panic and extreme avoidance. So you can become so overwhelmed by these symptoms that it's almost paralyzing, even though you're actually safe in that moment. So that's just a really simple example of how that fire alarm can misfire, even though in that very moment you are currently safe.
Could you translate that to us brain-wise? Like, what are the structures involved in our central nervous system that comprise this biological fire alarm?
Yeah, so when I talk about the brain, I like to keep it simple. Okay, trauma is already very difficult to understand emotionally, so I definitely don't want to make it more complicated. But when we're talking about the three parts of the brain, I specifically focus on the frontal lobe, the limbic system, and the brainstem. So the frontal lobe is what I like to refer to as kind of the smarty pants part of our brain. Mm-hmm. So it's the light bulb part of your brain where you kind of make those rational decisions. And it's responsible for reasoning, our language, our problem solving, our memory, but also our ability to verbalize things. So super important part of our brain. And the limbic system is a complement to the frontal lobe. So the limbic system is more emotional. It's sensory and it's nonverbal. And then you have the brainstem, and the brainstem is really responsible for those instinctive responses. So all the things that you do without even thinking about it. So your breathing, your heart rate, and all three parts of the brain are all involved when you're coping with any type of traumatic response.
And so what happens during this traumatic exposure?
So it's really important to note that all trauma is actually nonverbal. So what that means is that when a traumatic event occurs, the memory centers in the frontal lobe, so again, that part that's responsible for language and reasoning, that the part of your brain actually shuts down. So it stops firing. And it does that because the survival instincts, so the brainstem, and the emotional part of your brain, so the limbic system, they both need to kick in order to kind of take control and help protect you in a dangerous situation.
Can you illustrate the limbic system, one of the limbic system structure, and how that it responds to these kind of external stimuli?
So most people, I think, have heard of the amygdala. I think that's one of those words that you hear a lot in mental health. And that's the part of your brain that's the emotional memory center in your brain. So that activates our nervous system. When we talk about the amygdala, I think everyone has heard at some point the fight, flight, or freeze response. Although the freeze response, not many people have heard of, but it is included in those three. So again, we have the fight, flight, or freeze. And the nervous system can really be triggered by anything. So sometimes people don't even know when they're coping with trauma, what's triggered me. And that's okay. Because really it could be anything from, a thought you're having, a memory, something on the news, or even like a headache. Anything can really trigger the central nervous system. And when that happens, our body begins to feel like we are in danger. So when our body feels that way, instinctively, the brainstem is going to get activated. And that's going to have your body either speed up or slow down in order to survive.
Now, what about activity in the thalamus? Isn't that part of the limbic circuit as well?
Yeah. So while we have all of that stuff going on that I just talked about, which is quite a bit already, then we also have the thalamus. And that's the part of our brain that registers our sensory input. So sight, smell, sound, all of that stuff coming into our brain. And then the thalamus shoots that out to the amygdala, so the emotional part, and then the frontal lobe, which is problem solving. And really what that does is that gives you that feeling that you have when you're like, okay, this is what's happening to me right now in this moment. But what's really interesting about how that process breaks down is that the amygdala, so the emotional part, actually receives information faster than our frontal lobe. And what that does is that helps the body to secrete any stress hormones, so like cortisol, adrenaline, to defend against a threat. So in normal everyday life, when that process happens and the danger is no longer present, our body, calms down and it returns to previous functioning. But when people have had trauma, the body might not do that. It might not return to that state, and the stress hormones just continue to fire. So, when we look at all the parts of the brain already that are involved, you can see that there's so much going on after a trauma occurs, and your brain is really trying to process a lot at once.
Now, I understand the limbic circuit is sometimes referred to as the primitive lizard brain for us. Is there an example that you can provide of how that a perception can be interpreted by just this limbic circuit?
Yeah, so I'm gonna give kind of a simple, silly example. I think almost everyone is afraid of something in the world, and if you are a very smart person, you're probably afraid of spiders, like I am. So, I think we've all had that experience where you look down at your shirt and you think you see a spider, right? And what do? You usually freak out, you yell, you swat at your clothes, you run around, whatever you need to do to get the quote unquote spider off of you. And then you look down and you realize, oh, wait a minute, that was stupid. That's not a spider. That's just a fuzz on my clothes, right? So I give that example because your emotional response was triggered first, but then your frontal lobe kicks in and says, hey, you're okay. It's just a fuzz. It's not a spider. So that example translates to trauma in that when you have that prolonged trauma or that inability to recover, and we talked about that fire alarm always triggering, it's really hard to activate and get that frontal lobe back online. So for those people who are coping with any trauma during the pandemic and that fire alarm always misfiring, it's difficult to kind of realize that everything in the world is not a, quote unquote spider, and that your body is in fact safe.
Now, there's a part of our brain that prevents us from totally devolving into acting like insect-driven lizards. And this might be part of the frontal lobe?
Yeah, the frontal lobe is awesome in that you can build more pathways, through that part of the brain. So there's always ways to recover when you're activating the frontal lobe. And I think really the big question that you're asking yourself is, how do we get the frontal lobe, the limbic system, and the brainstem just all online working together? We don't want parts of the brain shutting down, then we can't really be effective in our lives, right? So engaging in certain skills, there's all kinds of coping strategies out there, but you really want to be focusing on skills that can help activate the frontal lobe, because really what that does is that quiets the alarm, so to speak, and that helps to make the body feel like you're no longer in danger and that you are safe and that those really distressing emotions will reduce. So we want to try and create both an internal and external environment that feels safe. And there's all kinds of coping skills that you can use for that. Things like self-soothing, grounding, breathing exercises. I'm sure you've heard a lot of different types of mindfulness activities that you can try. But I think ultimately, before we move on to what some of those things are, it's so important that you have more than one thing in your toolbox. When I go back to that example of the fire alarm going off in the house, right? What usually happens when it goes off? You have the moment of panic. You start screaming at your fire alarm, hoping that'll turn it off. You wave a towel in front of it, you open a door, you do all kinds of things to get the smoke to clear. That's kind of the same way you have to look at coping skills and strategies for yourself if that alarm is always misfiring, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So strengthening those connections in the frontal lobe, having these skills, these ability to kind of step outside these immediate responses can definitely minimize, I guess, the effects of trauma for us. Are there other things or certain groups that make them either more vulnerable or more resilient to developing trauma?
So I want to point out that any group, any person can be vulnerable to trauma, right? But anyone can also build resilience. That's across the board. However, there absolutely are certain populations that might be more vulnerable. And that might be due to access of just services like mental health services or medical providers, or even economic disparities or cultural stigmas. So some of those groups might be people in urban settings, even military veterans, the LGBTQ community, survivors of childhood trauma, or those who might struggle with substance abuse. Those might be some populations, just a few to name. But again, anybody can recover, anyone can heal, and anyone can build resiliency after a traumatic event. Just off the top of my head, I guess some factors that might help with healing, just in general, would definitely be building trustworthy connections, having good supports in your life, maintaining a routine, which I think we're seeing a lot of people not doing these days with quarantine, right? Cultivating a sense of safety. And if physical or emotional or spiritual wellness is important to you, definitely fostering a sense of that in your life. Lastly, I would say if all else fails and really nothing's working for you and you're seeing things get worse, you're going to want to maybe utilize appropriate services like mental health services or medical services or support groups.
So there's clearly some protective elements that we can use to increase our resilience, our sense of safety. I understand you wrote a great article on pillars of safety as one such example.
Yeah, I like to talk about the 3 pillars for creating safety because I think that these are important for anybody, whether you've had trauma or not. These 3 areas of your life, which is the physical, emotional, and social factors, are imperative for anybody in having a life that feels, healthy and balanced. So when we specifically talk about trauma recovery, I really need to stress that the most important first step is building a safety net. And what that means is that you need to have supports, you need to have coping strategies before you begin to process any type of trauma. I'm sure that, those of you who might be listening that may have experienced trauma, you may have had those experiences where you're talking about it, and you just don't feel better. No matter how much you talk about it, you don't feel better. And that's because really all parts of your brain and your body, they're not connecting because it doesn't feel safe to connect. It's too painful. So processing trauma events before you have that safety net can actually be re-traumatizing. So you need to build those supports. You need to build those skills. And I just need to really stress that because it's very important in any type of treatment. So there's many strategies that you can use to build a safety net. But again, like I said before about that toolbox, you need to have multiple things in there and you need to practice. Okay. And these things do not need to be fancy. They don't need to be hard. Life is hard enough. So you really want to keep it simple.
So this safety net is comprised partly of these 3 pillars in the article that you wrote. And you separate out the pillars. And the first one that you talk about is the physical pillar. Can you describe that in more detail?
Yeah. So before I'd said that idea of kind of that internal and external environment for safety, right? So the first one for physical would be both an internal and external physical environment that feels safe. And I think a lot of people, if you look in your own home, you probably do this already, like creating an exercise room or a yoga space, a space that's a place for self-care, right? However, I think when we're talking about a physical environment that's safe, you want this environment to be purposeful. And what that means is that you are purposefully going to this space to tune out negative thoughts and any distressing emotions and turning into being more mindful and compassionate towards yourself. Okay. So it's not just, I'm going to go into this workout room. You need to go in there with the purpose of creating that sense of safety. So there's 2 ways you can do this. You can actually just create a whole coping corner or coping room in your house. It could be something as simple as an area where you have arts and crafts, soft blankets, candles, any type of healthy distractions like music or art. Or if you don't have that space, a lot of people have a lot of people in their homes right now with quarantine, right? You have kids running around, whatever you have going on in your house, right? It's hard to have that space. Sometimes it's even hard to have that time, right? For self-care. You can create a coping kit. So I think everybody has a shoebox at home, I'm sure. You can just throw things in that box that make you feel calm and grounded. So some ideas of that would be like stress balls, photos of nature or loved ones, aromatherapy or favorite lotions, or even like inspirational quotes. But there's really no wrong way to do this. You just want to make sure that you have items in there that help you feel grounded and supported. And I'm sure as you're like listening to this, you're like, oh, that sounds so simple. It's just things in a box. But again, it's the idea of being purposeful about it and having things in there that make you feel safe. Because as we said before, when we're in that crisis state, your frontal lobe really isn't activating. So what might feel simple when you're calm becomes very, very difficult to access when you're in a crisis.
So it's not just the physical space. You're also talking about things that might provide some sort of comfort, almost like an adult transitional object for some. Are there other things that would fall under this physical pillar?
Yeah, I think that, again, we were talking about in quarantine, I think a lot of us have gotten off track, right? Our sleep times have gotten really, really off track. Our appetites, what we're eating, delivery, all of that, I think has gotten off track. So maybe ask yourself, when was the last time I ate a healthy meal? When was the last time I went to bed at a decent hour? When was the last time I showered first thing in the morning? If you are having trouble answering those questions, that's probably where you want to start. Setting a good bedtime, waking up at the same time, showering first thing in the morning, maybe even try getting dressed from the waist, down, because I think some of us are only looking professional from the waist up these days on camera. So I think just kind of going back to that sense of what would I do if I were leaving the house for work today, right? It's important to do that because I think at some point too, when you're transitioning out of quarantine, it's going to be helpful to have that rhythm and have that flow in your day.
No, that's an interesting point. And I'm glad you made it, that the pandemic itself, because it's thrown off our structure, maybe has weakened this physical pillar in some aspects. And so it sounds like taking care of general health, it definitely falls under this physical pillar.
Anybody who has met me or knows me knows that I constantly am stressing exercise. Exercise, exercise, exercise. It is so important, and it doesn't need to be strenuous. You don't need to be running miles a day, right? You could just be going for a walk, doing some yoga, some light weight training. But it's so important that, you realize how strong your body is and how your body will keep you moving even when you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders. I like to kind of use the example of, after a really bad storm, you see kind of debris everywhere. Everything's a mess. It's really chaotic. But then you see those really strong, grounded trees that are still rooted in the ground. That's kind of how our bodies are after a traumatic event. We have all these pieces everywhere. We don't know how to pick them up. We feel really chaotic, and yet our bodies are still standing. So using exercise to help you reconnect with your body is a really great way to increase your internal strength and empowerment.
I guess that makes sense, but for me, the gym can be a scary place, so maybe that's not a physically safe space for me. But let's move on to the second pillar, the emotional. Well, what can you tell us about that?
And I agree. I'm not somebody who goes to the gym, by the way, because I'm too lazy to even put on like those cute workout outfits that they have these days. I don't want to do all that in the morning. It's too much. So, what's really great about that is that they have so many things online now. You could just do right from home with like no equipment. So again, it doesn't need to be anything strenuous like going to the gym. If that's provoking a lot of anxiety, it could be, going for a walk, walking up and down your stairs at home, something really simple. So now going into the second pillar.
Yeah.
That's the emotional part. Emotional safety does not mean eliminating emotion. I mean, there's so many times that I'm hearing, I don't want to feel anxious. I don't want to feel angry. I don't want to feel scared. I don't want to feel anything but being happy. That's not realistic. Like, that's not being human. And if we shut off one emotion, we actually shut them all off. So you need all the emotions. They're helpful in getting things done in life. So emotional safety really means having the ability to regulate your emotion, both by yourself, but also with the help of others. And it's really important not to push those emotions away. Like I said before, that idea of shutting down emotions, it's not healthy. And it's not conducive for long-term recovery to try and shut any of those emotions down. So I really urge you to ask yourself the question, when you're having those negative emotions that you don't want, ask yourself, if a friend came to me right now and they were feeling this way, would I push them away? Would I tell them to stop feeling that way and hang up the phone? Probably not. If you're doing that, that might be a whole nother, podcast in regards to how to treat your friends, but you probably wouldn't do that. So you want to try doing the same thing to yourself the next time you're feeling emotions and kind of invite them in and nurture yourself.
Do you have specific skills or strategies to deal with really intense, difficult emotions if you don't think distraction is a good one?
Yeah, so distractions are always great. We just don't want to distract ourselves all the times, right? So it's kind of that idea of putting our emotions on the shelf. But if you keep putting your emotions on the shelf, your shelf's going to break, right? You got to take them off. You got to deal with your emotions at some point. However, when you're feeling really distressed, there are definitely things that you can do. And one of the really simple strategies you can do is a self-soothing technique. I think they're great. You can do them anywhere and they're super simple. And a good example of self-soothing is, think about how you feel first thing in the morning and you smell coffee. You might wake up super grumpy, but I know when I wake up and I smell coffee, I go from grumpy to slightly less grumpy just from the smell. I love coffee. Or there's that idea of walking into a house with like fresh baked cookies, right? You might immediately feel that sense of warmth or even a nice memory. So it's really cool. It's really great how your senses can impact your emotions when you're being really mindful about the world around you. So self-soothing is also a type of grounding skill. And what grounding means is that it's literally helping you to reconnect with the ground and the world around you when you're under a lot of emotional distress. So engaging in this technique can be super helpful when you're having really intense emotions of panic or distress or flashbacks, bring you back to the present moment.
So how can our listeners get started with practicing some specific skills?
So a real simple skill for self-soothing that anybody can try. And I just also want to say that these are kind of starting points, right? If you're somebody who's really struggling with trauma, you definitely are going to need more tools than this. But one of the techniques that you can try is the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. And what that means is using all 5 of your senses to connect with the world around you and counting down from the number 5. So the first sense that you would start with is sight. And you would name 5 things that you can see right now. You can verbalize them out loud if you're in a place that you can talk out loud and it's not going to look a little strange. Or you can say them inside, if you're on public transportation or you're at work and you don't want to talk out loud. So you might say things like, I see my computer screen. I see my car outside. I see the pen that I'm holding. But you would just name 5 things that you can see around you. And then you would count down. So next thing would be 4 things that you can touch. And that might be things and sensations that are in and around your body. So it might be, I feel the chair on my back. I feel my sweater that is warm. If you're outside, maybe it's I feel the breeze, but 4 things that you can touch. And then we would just continue. So 3 things that you can hear. And again, it would be really simple. It might just be a clock ticking. It'd be music playing. Or if you're in a really quiet environment, it might just be your own breathing. And then 2 things that you can smell. That might be a scented candle, freshly cut grass, anything that's nearby. And then lastly would be 1 thing you can taste. And I always encourage people, if they're practicing this skill, throw some mints or some gum in your bag or your pocket so you always have something you could grab. Because I think we don't always have food or things around us, right, all the time. So 1 thing you can taste, that might be mints or coffee, or it might even be the toothpaste that's still on your breath from the morning. So by using all of your senses and then kind of counting down, it really keeps you focused in the present moment, it helps you reconnect, and it helps to activate that frontal lobe again.
I like that a lot. It's a very mindful approach to this grounding that you recommend earlier. Now, my wife says that I have a lot of unhealthy coping skills. I am sure she's totally wrong because I'm always right. But what are some things that may not be as helpful?
So if your wife is listening, you're always right. She just needs to hear that. Your wife is always right, no matter what. That's just the marriage advice for everybody. I think everyone is guilty of having unhealthy coping skills at times. That's normal. We're not perfect. We're human. Okay. But we talked earlier about how that emotional pain can really result in those somatic symptoms, right? So those health problems, headaches, energy issues, but just weakening your immune system overall. And what can happen when you're feeling like that is that in the short term, people want that immediate relief. So we've seen a lot, unfortunately, in the pandemic of increased substance use, right? A lot of alcohol use, substance use. And in the short term, you might feel better, but in the long term, you're creating a very negative vicious cycle where symptoms are going to return with more intensity. You might increase those medical or mental health issues. And then, if you're on medications already, which a lot of people are for physical illness or mental health, you're potentially creating a really lethal combination. So if you're noticing that you're turning more to substances, you definitely want to speak to a healthcare professional so that you can cope in a healthier way.
Okay, so maybe I'll concede that my video game binges are not so healthy in the long term. So
it depends which video game.
Healthier. Yeah. So what would be some healthier approaches that are more acceptable to my wife?
Yeah, and again, I would say it depends on which video game, because there are some good ones out there. But I always beat my husband in Mario Kart, I'll tell you right now. But I would say that, every single day, you really want to set goals for yourself. We forget, how important it is to create a sense of accomplishment all the time. And when people have had trauma, I think that the negative self-talk and the feelings of hopelessness and shame and guilt, it can paralyze you. So setting a small goal and creating a sense of accomplishment might be just getting out of bed in the morning. It might be taking a shower, and that's perfectly okay. If that's where you're at, that's where you're at. And if that's your goal for the day, set it and accomplish it. And then as you make progress, you might want to create a sense of mastery, such as like trying photography or trying some new hobby that you've always wanted to do. But it's all of these mini accomplishments that you try every single day that ultimately are going to add up to a larger change and then cause you to feel more competent and effective in your everyday life.
Mm. Now you also close with the third pillar, which is more about people, the social environment.
Yeah, I think, so many people are so lonely right now, right? And they're so disconnected, and people are just not interacting the way we were 8 months ago.
Yeah.
It's hard to even just go to a restaurant, right? Or when I'm in the grocery store, people would always talk to me. Now there's more of that isolation when you're in the grocery store, if you're even going at all. So feeling connected to people and people you trust is essential. People need people. No matter what you think or what you feel right now, we all need each other. But when we've had, any type of trauma, sometimes connecting with people feels really dangerous. It feels really negative. So it's important to, find those right supports and build a social network that's emotionally and physically safe so that it's conducive to maintaining a healthy lifestyle.
Now, are there other concrete suggestions of how we can increase our social connectivity, particularly during this time of, like you mentioned, social distancing?
Yeah. And, some of these might feel like common sense, but what's interesting about common sense is we often don't listen to it or do it. Right. So these are
now you're sounding like my wife.
She's a wise woman. So these are just some gentle reminders of what you can do right now with quarantine going on. So I think when we talk about supports, we have all been in that situation where we're in a crisis and we know we shouldn't call that one person, right? That one friend we all have that always gives the worst advice and they're not supportive and they're judgmental. But what do? We call them anyway, right? And it's like, why did I do that when I get off the phone? So you got to know who to call. If in a crisis you struggle with that, write them down, plug them into your phone, plug it into a note. These are the 4 people I would call in a crisis. These are some emergency contacts. These are some email addresses I have so that they're in reach when you need them in a crisis. I mentioned before, join a support group. They're everywhere now. You can get them online. You don't even need to leave the house. They have support groups for just about anything, for mental health, spirituality, grief, substance use. But feeling connected to other people who have similar experiences is really imperative right now and will help to reduce the feelings of loneliness that you have. I would say in response to that, know who to call, you also need to just call people in general, okay? With depression and trauma, you almost get the sense of tunnel vision. And I think for those people who are listening that have had depression or trauma or are currently struggling, you know what that tunnel vision feels like. It's makes your life and your scope of life really, really small and really dark. And you can only see this tiny, tiny, tiny little hole of things in your life. And you kind of miss all that other stuff that you have that helps to support you. So depression, anxiety, trauma symptoms, it kind of tells you I'm a burden. You know, my friends don't want to hear from me. My family doesn't want to hear from me. And those negative thoughts are just not true. Okay. Your family wants to hear from you. Your friends want to hear from you. You're not a burden to the people you love. So make sure that your negative thoughts don't win and that you are calling your friends and you're staying connected. In doing so, I think you also need to be creative. So use those virtual meetings, all those platforms to actually see your loved ones. And then lastly, if none of this is working and things are really, really getting unmanageable, please reach out to a healthcare professional or a licensed therapist because you deserve to get the support that you need right now in your healing process.
Now, this is a lot of tremendously helpful information, particularly germane to everything that we're going through this year. Do you have any final suggestions or final takeaway?
Yeah, so, I know that we talked about a lot of different things. And we talked a little bit about the brain, a little bit about things you can do and what trauma really is in general. And I'd said a few times throughout this podcast that trauma is really complicated. It's not just as simple as, a 15, 20-minute discussion. So it's really important that no matter where you are in your experience right now, try not to judge yourself. Have some compassion for who you are as a person and what you've been through. I like to remind myself that if we could just think or logically talk our way out of our traumatic or emotional responses, then no one would really have any problems, would we? Right? The world would just be perfect. And that's not being a human. That's not real life. So there's really no magic pill. I know people are often looking for it, and there's no magic coping skill. And really everything that you need in life to make a life that's fulfilling, you already have. I think we just sometimes need a little bit of help finding it. So I hope some of these things were helpful, and I encourage you to just try something small every single day to take care of you. And ultimately, the hope is that that will result in a larger change and hopefully a more balanced life.
So thank you so much. I think your expertise and the information that you presented is so tremendously helpful. I think it's a great lesson that we can all learn, that we have to pay attention to how we're feeling, what we're going through. And these are difficult times, and it's okay to reach out for help if we need it. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.